The Wild West you've seen in movies was far quieter than you imagine. Yet one shocking truth stands out. In some frontier towns, the average life expectancy was just 35 years. Not because of constant shootouts, but because disease, harsh weather, and brutal living conditions stalked every sunrise. Tonight, we're stepping into that world. Hello and welcome. Before you close your eyes and get cozy, make sure to subscribe and like the video, and let me get you to sleep flawlessly. Chapter 1. A preliminary note on geographic ambiguity. To truly understand why the day-to-day reality of the West would be so profoundly challenging, we must begin by dispelling a primary comforting illusion. We must address the notion that the Wild West was a specific destination, a place one could point to on a map with any real certainty. This is our first, and perhaps most significant point of departure from the modern mind. The modern experience is rooted in precise location. Coordinates, addresses, zip codes. We navigate with a digital certainty that leaves little room for ambiguity. The West, however, was not this. It was less a place and more a condition, a process of movement, a shifting frontier line that existed more in the mind than on the ground. Consider the perspective of someone in Boston or Philadelphia in the year 1849. The West was a vast, undifferentiated blank space beginning just beyond the muddy banks of the Missouri River. It was a single, formidable idea. But for someone in St. Louis a decade later, that idea had already fractured and moved. The West was now the plains of Kansas, the arid basins of Utah, or the rumored gold fields of the distant Colorado Territory. It had ceased to be a monolithic concept and had become a series of potential destinations, each with its own whispered reputation. This ambiguity was not merely academic. It was a practical, daily confusion. If you were to announce you were going west, the immediate necessary follow-up questions were, west to where? And by which route? The choice between the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, or a voyage by ship to Panama and up the Pacific coast was not merely a choice of scenery. It was a decision that dictated the specific texture of your hardship, the type of dust you would eat, the variety of thirst you would endure, the particular flavor of your isolation. Furthermore, the very landscape resisted simple naming. What was a territory 1 year could be hastily. Chapter 2. Defining the West. A chronological conundrum. Just as the West defies a single point on a map, it equally resists being pinned to a specific period on a calendar. We often picture it as a distinct, if somewhat hazy, era. A 30-year window of dust and legend stretching from the end of the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century. This is a tidy narrative, but it is a retrospective fiction, a compression of countless local timelines into one convenient story. The true chronology of the West is not a single line, but a series of overlapping waves, each breaking at a different time on a different shore. To understand the disorientation you would face, you must consider the profound disconnect between historical time and lived experience. The Wild West was not a unified period you lived through. It was a temporary condition you might arrive in, often by chance, at the precise moment of its peak, or just as likely in its lingering aftermath. Your entire reality was dictated by this accident of timing. For a 49er in the Sierra Nevada foothills, the frenzied peak of lawlessness and opportunity had largely subsided by the mid-1850s. The chaos had moved on, leaving behind scarred hills and settled mining codes. Yet, at that very same moment, a farmer in Kansas might have been experiencing the first true onset of wildness, as conflict over the slavery question erupted into guerrilla warfare along the border. While one man's frontier was already receding into memory, another's was just igniting. A decade later, the brief, iconic era of the Great Texas to Kansas cattle drives was in full swing, a period that would itself last less than 20 years before the twin forces of the railroad and barbed wire made it obsolete. Yet, as those drovers guided their herds north, a prospector in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory was just entering his region's frantic, violent boom, a decade after the famed Comstock lode in Nevada had already passed. Chapter 3. The Myth of Empty Space, Pre-existing Inhabitants. A common pillar of the Romantic vision is that of an empty land, a vast and silent canvas awaiting the arrival of new settlers. This idea of vacancy, of a world held in pause, is perhaps the most profound misunderstanding of all. The West was not empty. It was thoroughly, complexly occupied. Your arrival, therefore, would not have been an entry into silence, but an intrusion into a long-established and intricate web of life, law, and tradition. Before the first wagon rut scarred the prairie, the land was already spoken for. It was mapped in the migratory patterns of the Plains nations, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, whose understanding of territory was not one of rigid borders, but of seasonal use, sacred sites, and hunting grounds. These were not vague claims, but precise and vital geographies, known down to the individual creek bed where the best berries grew or the specific valley where the buffalo wintered. Your concept of unclaimed land would have been, to them, both incomprehensible and offensive. Furthermore, you would have been a latecomer to a landscape already shaped by other European arrivals. Spanish and Mexican land grants in the Southwest defined ownership through a completely different legal and cultural system, one of community grants and grazing rights that often clashed with the Anglo idea of individual plots. In the Pacific Northwest, the infrastructure of the Hudson's Bay Company, its forts, its trade routes, its relationships with indigenous trappers, had set the economic and social rhythm for decades. This means your every movement would have been observed, your presence noted, your actions interpreted within existing frameworks you likely did not understand. That seemingly deserted canyon was a travel corridor. That attractive grove of trees by the river was a traditional campsite. That flat, open plain was a crucial grazing range. Your mere choice of where to build a sadi or... Chapter 4. Transportation. The primacy of the railroad timetable. Once we have settled, however incompletely, the questions of where and when and who was already there, we must then confront the most fundamental practical problem, movement. How would you traverse this ambiguous, contested, and vast space? The answer defines the rhythm of your days, and it is here we find a central, quiet tyranny. That of scheduled, mechanical time. While the image is of the lone rider or the creaking wagon train, and these were realities especially earlier, the true reshaping of Western experience came with the railroad. Its influence was not merely about speed, but about the imposition of an external, unyielding clock. Your life began to synchronize with the timetable. The arrival of the train, whether once a day or once a week, became the pivotal event around which all other activity bent. Consider the logistics of your existence in a small town along the line. The delivery of mail, the latest newspapers from the East, the shipment of tools, cloth, and pre-made goods. All of it was subject to the railroad schedule. More critically, the prices of the goods you sought to sell, be it cattle, grain, or ore, were set by markets accessible only via those rails. Your economic pulse beat to the rhythm of the freight car. This created a peculiar form of anxiety, distinct from the more visceral fears of the trail. It was the anxiety of waiting for something abstract yet vital. You would find yourself at the depot not because the train was due, but because it might be due, as schedules were famously optimistic. You would wait in the lee of the station house, watching the empty, shimmering line of tracks recede to the horizon. The world was reduced to listening for a distant whistle that often failed to sound at the appointed hour. A delay of a day could mean spoiled produce, a missed contract, or simply the prolonged absence of a letter from home. Your time was no longer your own. Chapter 5. The Overland Journey. A study in monotony and dust. If your entry into the West predated the railroad's thin steel lines, or if you ventured away from them, your journey regressed to a more elemental state. Here we must dispel another dramatic notion, that of constant peril and eventful travel. The dominant experience of the overland journey was not Indian attack or river crossing disaster, though those were fears that lived in the mind. The true, wearing reality was a profound and inescapable monotony, punctuated by a single, pervasive element: dust. The days would not have varied in their essential structure. The pre-dawn stirring, the damping of fires, the yoking of oxen, a slow, patient, and stubborn process. The wagon itself was not a vehicle of comfort, but a lumbering wooden crate. Its motion was not a smooth roll, but a continuous series of lurches, jolts, and creaks as it negotiated prairie dog holes, sagebrush clumps, and rocky ground. Every item within it would shift and settle, clinking and groaning in a constant, low symphony of complaint. And then the dust. It was not merely on the ground. It was the air itself, the passage of wagons, animals, and people ahead of you on the trail. For you were almost never truly alone. Churned the earth into a fine, suspended powder. It rose in warm, ochre clouds that hung in the windless heat of day. It coated your skin, a grit that mixed with sweat. It lined your nostrils and throat. You tasted it in your dry mouth, a mineral tang with every breath. It sifted into the wagons, settling over food stores, bedding, and clothing. At night, you shook it from your blankets, only to have more settle by morning. The landscape, often described as awe-inspiring, would have become, through weeks of exposure, a dull repetition. The sameness of the grassy plains, the distant, unchanging line of mountains that never seemed to grow closer, the relentless sun tracing the same arc in a bleached sky. The mind, deprived of N. Chapter 6. Weather, inconsistencies in precipitation. Beyond the dust of the trail, upon reaching your vague destination in its uncertain era, you would then become subject to a new, elemental variable, the weather. Not as a backdrop, but as a primary, capricious actor in your daily life. The climate of the West, in many of its regions, could be described not as a pattern, but as a series of pronounced and unreliable absences. The central, defining feature was not a type of storm, but the inconsistency of rainfall. You might have chosen your plot of land based on a season of unusual promise. A spring of adequate rains, painting the prairie a deceptive, lush green. Your first year would be built on this expectation. You would break the sod, plant your seeds, wheat, corn, a small kitchen garden with a sense of fragile optimism. And then, the following growing season, the rains would simply fail to arrive in the expected measure. The sky would present itself as a vast, unbroken dome of hard blue. Day after day, the sun would rise, clear and potent, and set in a blaze of indifferent color. The soil, so promisingly dark and rich when damp, would transform. It would lighten in color, then crack. A network of fine fissures would spread across your field, a map of drought. The young plants would stall, their leaves curling, turning a brittle grayish green. You would watch them every morning for a sign of change. You would scan the western horizon for the promise of cloud. When clouds did gather, they could be a false hope. Great, anvil-headed thunderheads would build in the afternoon heat, marching across the plains with a dark, majestic drama. You would stop your work, watching. The air would grow still and heavy. And then, with a dry crack of lightning, the storm might simply pass you by, trailing a curtain of verga. Rain that evaporated before it ever touched the earth, and leaving behind only a scent of ozone and a deeper sense of resignation. Or it might arrive with. Chapter 7. The prairie wind. A constant, drying presence. If the rain was an unreliable and often absent actor, there was another, far more constant meteorological force. One that never failed to report for duty, season after season, day and night. This was the wind. Not the occasional gust or storm-born blast, but the ceaseless, ambient wind of the open plains. It was not an event. It was a condition of the atmosphere, a permanent exhale of the continent. You would become aware of it first as a sound. A low, resonant hum as it pressed against the corner of your dwelling. A sighing through the cracks in a poorly chinked log wall, or a faint, papery rustle as it skated over the grassy sod of your roof. If you used canvas, a tent or a wagon cover, it was a perpetual snapping and flapping, a restless percussion that frayed the edges of both the material and your nerves. But its primary effect was not auditory. It was a drying force. It worked in a silent partnership with the sun. Where the sun baked, the wind desiccated. It would pull the moisture from the soil with a gentle, persistent suction, deepening the cracks. It would wick the sweat from your skin almost before it could form, leaving a fine, salty grit in its place. Your lips would chap and split. Your eyes would feel perpetually grainy and irritated. Any exposed wood on your tools or your wagon would warp and shrink. Barrel stoves would dry and leak. Carried things. Not just dust, but the smell of distant fires, the chill of a far-off snowmelt, or the alkaline tang of a dry lake bed 50 miles away, could erase the tracks you made yesterday. It would hollow out your voice if you tried to shout to a neighbor across a field, carrying the words away and leaving only a faint, vowel-shaped echo. This wind was a reminder of exposure. There was no true shelter from it, only varying degrees of its presence. Inside your claim shack, it was a whisper and a draft. Outside, it was a physical pressure, a lean. Chapter 9. The Scarcity of Fresh Produce, Scurvy's Itchy Legacy. From the monotonous sufficiency of beans and hardtack, we must consider a critical absence. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables was not merely a culinary disappointment. It was a slow-burning physiological crisis. Your body would begin to miss what it never received, and this deficiency would manifest in subtle, then progressively distressing ways. The most common and quietly debilitating consequence of this absence was scurvy. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, did not always arrive with the dramatic, textbook symptoms of loose teeth and bleeding gums seen in sailors. On the frontier, it often presented in a slower, more insidious manner. The first signs were a general and profound lethargy, a heaviness in the limbs that made the simplest chores, chopping wood, drawing water, feel Herculean. This was not ordinary tiredness, but a deep-seated weariness that sleep did not cure. Then came the skin. It would become sallow, dry, and strangely rough to the touch. Small wounds, a scratch from a wire, a blister from a tool, would refuse to heal properly. They would linger, becoming shallow, angry ulcers. Old scars might even reopen. Your body's fundamental ability to repair itself was diminishing. But the most characteristic, and peculiarly maddening, symptom was an intense, generalized itch. It was not localized to a rash, but seemed to live just beneath the skin everywhere. It would worsen at night, robbing you of rest. You would scratch until your skin was raw, yet find no relief. This persistent, phantom itching, coupled with the pervasive fatigue, created a state of constant low-grade misery. It eroded patience and mental fortitude. The cure was simple in theory. A handful of wild onions, a brew of pine needle tea, the tart berries of a prairie rosehip. But in practice, especially during winter months or in arid regions where such forage was scarce, these sources were elusive. Chapter 8. Dietary Staples. Beans, hardtack, more beans. Subject to the whims of geography, time, and weather, we must now turn to the most immediate and inescapable requirement: sustenance. The romantic vision might suggest a diet of fresh game and frontier abundance. The reality, for the vast majority, was a cycle of profound culinary limitation, defined by shelf stability and the sheer physics of bulk transport. Your daily nourishment would have revolved around a small, durable group of commodities, their preparation a repetitive ritual. The central pillar was the bean. The dried, rock-like legume, often the navy or pinto variety, was perfect for the West. It was lightweight, dense with calories, and would not spoil. It was also, in its unprepared state, nearly inedible. Thus, a significant portion of a day's energy, particularly for a solitary homesteader or a cowboy on the trail, was devoted to rendering beans edible. They required hours of soaking in precious water, followed by more hours of slow boiling over a carefully managed fire. In the high altitudes of many western regions, water boiled at a lower temperature, extending this process even further. The result was a vast, simmering pot of bland, starchy mush, occasionally flavored with a precious chunk of salt pork or bacon fat, if one had any. You would eat beans for supper. You would eat the reheated beans for breakfast. You would take cold beans for your midday meal. The cycle was relentless. Its companion was hardtack. This was not bread, but its fossilized ancestor. A simple mixture of flour, water, and salt, baked until all moisture was removed, creating a slab of nearly indestructible carbohydrate. It was so hard it risked breaking teeth. To eat it, you would typically tap it against a rock to split it, then soak the fragments in coffee or broth until they achieved a soft, soggy consistency, like a flavorless, gritty porridge. It was a defense against starvation, not a pleasure. Fresh meat was a RA. Chapter 10. Coffee, grounds, chicory, and occasional grit. Amidst the dietary deficiencies and the monotony, there was one universal solace, one ritual that punctuated the wearying days: coffee. It was not a luxury, but a necessary fuel, a psychological anchor. However, the coffee of the frontier bore little resemblance to its modern counterpart. Its preparation and consumption were an exercise in compromise and texture. True coffee beans were a precious commodity, expensive and subject to the vagaries of supply. They were often stretched or outright replaced by substitutes. The most common of these was chicory, the roasted and ground root of a common plant. Chicory brewed into a dark, inky liquid that mimicked coffee's color and bitterness, but lacked its caffeine and rich aroma. It had a distinct, earthy, slightly woody taste. Often, what you drank was a blend, a handful of true coffee grounds extended with a greater volume of chicory. In the hardest times, it might be chicory alone. The grinding was a coarse affair. Without proper mills, beans or chicory root were often pounded with a rock or the butt of a knife handle. This resulted not in a fine powder, but in a mix of granular pieces and larger, jagged fragments. Brewing was a crude process. The grounds were tossed into a pot of boiling water, sometimes with a crushed eggshell thrown in to help the particles settle. A theory of dubious merit. The resulting liquid was, therefore, a substance to be approached with care. You would pour it slowly, letting the pot's lip catch the larger floating grounds. Even then, the first sip was often a cautious testing of temperature and texture. It was common to feel fine, silt-like particles on your tongue. Occasionally, a larger fragment would escape, a gritty surprise amidst the bitter warmth. You would learn to swallow around it, or to gently remove it with your fingers. Yet, despite all this, the ersatz taste, the gritty mouth feel, the ritual held its power. The act of. Chapter 11: Water Sources. A survey of bacterial content. Beyond the compromised comfort of coffee lay the most fundamental requirement: water. Here, the romance of the clear, rushing mountain stream collides with a grimmer biological reality. Your relationship with water in the West was one of necessary suspicion. Every source, no matter how pristine in appearance, was a potential vector of incapacitating, or even fatal, illness. You would learn to judge water not by its clarity, for even the clearest spring could be contaminated upstream by an animal carcass or a mineral seep, but by its context. A slow-moving prairie creek, warm and silty, was a known hazard. A stagnant pond, green with algae, was a last resort. The ideal was a fast-flowing, rocky-bottomed stream, but even this offered no guarantee. The primary threats were bacterial, the agents of cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery. These illnesses did not announce themselves with subtlety. They struck with violent, dehydrating force. Cholera, in particular, could reduce a healthy adult to a state of profound weakness within hours, its symptoms a brutal and humiliating evacuation of the body's fluids. In a remote setting, without access to clean water to rehydrate, the cycle was often fatal. This constant threat necessitated a daily calculus of risk and labor. You could attempt to boil all your drinking water, a fuel-intensive and time-consuming process that did not improve the often alkaline or mineral-heavy taste. You might try well digging, a task of backbreaking effort with no promise of striking a pure aquifer. Many simply drank from the most likely source and hoped, a quiet gamble played every single day. The taste of the water itself was a geography lesson. It could carry the flat, metallic tang of iron, the astringent bite of lime, or the vaguely salty residue of gypsum. Sweet, clean-tasting water was a rarity to be remarked upon. More often, you drank thirstily despite the flavor, the act-tinged why. Chapter 13: Log Cabin Construction. An overview of chinking. In regions where timber was available, the log cabin presented itself as the superior alternative to sod. Promised solidity, a certain rustic permanence. But its construction was not the simple stacking of picturesque logs one might imagine. It was a complex, labor-intensive process of fitting and sealing, centered on the critical, never-ending task of chinking. First, suitable trees had to be felled, stripped of their branches, and notched. The notching, the cutting of concave or saddle-shaped joints at the ends of each log, required a careful eye and a steady hand with an axe. A poor notch meant a gap, a structural weakness, and a greater channel for the wind. As the walls rose, log by heavy log, the structure took shape, but it was a shape full of long vertical voids between each rounded timber. This is where chinking came in. Chinking was the sealant, the barrier between you and the elements. The ideal mixture was a blend of clay and sand, sometimes with animal hair or dry grass, known as binders, mixed in to give it cohesion. This substance had to be worked by hand into every crack, pressed deep into the gap from both inside and out. It was slow, messy, finger-aching work, and it was temporary. The chinking was a dynamic part of the structure, not a fixed one. As the green logs seasoned and dried, they would shrink and twist, creating new gaps. The clay itself, exposed to the cycles of rain, snow, and sun, would dry, crack, and eventually crumble. A hard freeze could cause it to pop loose in chunks. Therefore, chinking was not a one-time task, but a routine piece of home maintenance, as regular as splitting firewood. Each autumn, you would survey the walls, mixing a new batch of daub to press into the fresh cracks that had appeared over the summer, preparing for the winter winds. Thus, the log cabin was never truly finished. It was a structure in a slow state of settlement and decay, and your law. Chapter 12. The Architecture of Sod, Damp and Insectal. When timber was scarce, as it was on the vast, treeless plains, you turned to the material beneath your feet, the earth itself. The sod house, or soddy, was a pragmatic response to a profound lack. It was not a quaint, pastoral dwelling, but a structure that embodied a slow, organic compromise with the land. Its primary characteristic was not warmth or coolness, but a pervasive, inescapable dampness. Constructing one was an exercise in sheer exertion. Using a special sodbuster plow or a simple spade, you would cut the prairie into bricks. These were not clean, geometric units, but heavy, matted blocks, held together by the dense, fibrous root system of the grasses, a network of blue grama and buffalo grass that had knit the soil together for centuries. You would stack them, root side up, like a dark, damp masonry, leaving gaps for a door and perhaps a single small window. The interior atmosphere was singular. The thick earthen walls provided excellent insulation against the prairie's temperature extremes, but they also trapped humidity. The air inside carried a distinct, loamy smell, the scent of soil, of decay, of enclosed earth. This constant moisture was the defining feature of daily life. Your bedding, if placed against an exterior wall, might feel faintly clammy. Books, paper, or cloth left in a corner would develop a soft, limp feel. And within this dampness, life flourished. The sod house was not a human home alone. It was an ecosystem. Insects, whose eggs and larvae were embedded in the very fabric of the walls, would hatch and emerge. Small black beetles, ants, and the occasional spider were constant, quiet co-inhabitants. The most unwelcome guest, however, was the soddy flea, a catch-all term for various jumping insects that thrived in the organic material. They would infest bedding and clothing, leading to restless nights and small, itchy bites. Rain transformed the dwelling. A steady damp. Chapter 14. Tent living. The flapping canvas at dawn. For those in transit, or for those who arrived at a boom site with nothing, the most immediate shelter was the canvas tent. It represented the absolute minimum, a thin, permeable barrier between the self and the sky. Its virtues were its portability and speed of erection. Its drawbacks defined the texture of daily existence, particularly in the first fragile hours of the morning. The primary characteristic of a tent was its acoustics. Canvas is not a silent material. It reacted to every atmospheric change. At dawn, as the night's stillness gave way to the first movements of day, the tent would begin to speak. A faint pre-dawn breeze, too soft to be felt on the skin, would first manifest as a gentle, restless stirring of the canvas walls. A soft, rustling sigh. As the wind picked up, this would escalate into a series of measured, percussive flaps. A loose guy rope would tap rhythmically against the taut fabric. Thwop, thwop, thwop. The sound was not loud, but it was pervasive, resonating through the enclosed space. It was a sound that penetrated the last layers of sleep, a persistent, mechanical announcement of the coming day that could not be ignored. The interior environment was one of condensation and extreme temperature fluctuation. Your breath, your body heat, would create a damp, close atmosphere within the tent at night. With the morning's first light, the sun would strike the canvas, creating a startlingly quick temperature rise inside, while the outside air might still be chill. This often resulted in a fine, cold mist of condensation raining down from the ceiling if the canvas was disturbed, a rude, damp shock. There was no privacy from sound or, often, from light. The rising sun would turn the tent walls a luminous, glowing yellow, erasing any semblance of darkness. Conversations from neighboring tents, the sounds of animals, the clatter of a camp being stirred to life. All of it filtered through Una. Chapter 15. The Economics of Hardware. Nails as Currency. In a landscape defined by scarcity and immense distances, the value of objects transformed. It was not merely the grand commodities, gold, cattle, land, that held worth, but the most mundane manufactured items. Among these, few were as precious, as literally foundational as the common nail. In many remote settlements and along migratory routes, nails transcended their humble purpose to become a de facto currency, a medium of exchange that spoke to the fundamental needs of a building civilization. The reasons were logistical. Nails were heavy for their size, and shipping costs overland were prohibitive. They were also consumed in vast quantities for any permanent construction, not just for cabins but for furniture, tool handles, wagons, and coffins. A blacksmith could forge nails, but this was a slow, fuel-intensive process, diverting him from more specialized work. Therefore, imported, machine-cut nails were a coveted commodity. Their value was not theoretical. You might see a horse traded for a keg of nails. A pound of nails could be bartered for a sack of flour, a pair of boots, or a day's labor. Because they were uniform and countable, they offered a more reliable standard than bartering dissimilar goods. A man's wealth could be measured, in part, by the weight of nails he held in reserve. This led to careful, almost reverential practices. Nails pulled from old structures were never discarded. They were straightened painstakingly on a rock or with a hammer for reuse. A bent nail was not trash, but a project. Wagon breakdowns were disasters not only for the delay, but for the potential loss of hardware. If you possessed nails, you protected them from dampness to prevent rust, and you guarded them from theft as you would coin. Thus, the simple act of construction was underpinned by a miniature economy. Driving a nail into a board was not just an act of building. It was an expenditure of capital. Each ham. Chapter 16. Firewood. A daily and laborious necessity. Beyond the economics of construction lay the daily arithmetic of survival, and its most constant equation was fire. Fire meant cooked food, boiled water, and warmth. It was a non-negotiable, and so, a significant portion of every day in every season was devoted to its fuel, the securing, the processing, and the rationing of firewood. This was not a chore of convenience. In timbered regions, it meant hours spent with an axe or a crosscut saw. The felling of a tree was merely the beginning. It then had to be limbed, its trunk bucked into manageable rounds, and those rounds split into burnable pieces. Each stage was a transfer of energy from your body into potential heat. In areas where trees were scarce, you turned to what the land offered. Sagebrush, which burned hot and fast, or the dense, gnarly roots of mesquite or juniper, which required exhausting effort to dig from the hard ground. On the plains, you might resort to burning buffalo chips, the sun-dried dung of bison. This material burned with a slow, low, odorless flame, but its gathering was a daily, humble scavenging of the prairie. The woodpile, therefore, was a direct measure of your foresight and labor. You learned to judge not just by its height, but by its seasoning. Green wood, full of sap, would hiss and smoke, providing little heat. Properly seasoned wood, split and stacked for months to dry, was a form of stored wealth. The size of your pile in late autumn was a source of anxiety or quiet confidence, a visible forecast of your comfort through the coming winter. The consumption was relentless. A cook fire for beans required a steady feed of kindling and split logs. A heating stove, if you had one, could consume an armful of wood in a few hours on a cold night. There was no thermostat, only the rhythm of adding another piece, opening or closing a damper, and feeling the fleeting, radiant warmth before the cycle began again. Your relationship W. Chapter 17. Candles and Lanterns. Measuring light by the hour. With the sun's departure, your world contracted. The darkness was not the soft, elective gloom of a modern room with drawn curtains, but a profound, enveloping absence, broken only by the small, fragile islands of light you could create and afford. The economics of illumination governed your evenings, rationing your time for everything beyond basic survival. The candle was the basic unit of this economy. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were the most common. They provided a soft, yellow, guttering flame that produced as much smoke as light and carried a faint, greasy odor. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but were a luxury. You did not light a candle casually. Its life was measured in hours, and you planned activities around its slow, steady consumption. Mending a shirt, reading a Bible, writing a letter, these were tasks assigned a specific, flickering portion of the evening. When the candle burned low, the task was over. The kerosene lantern offered a superior, adjustable light. Its glass chimney magnified and steadied the flame, casting a wider circle of illumination. But kerosene, like everything else, had to be purchased and transported. You learned to trim the wick precisely. A poorly trimmed wick would smoke, blackening the glass chimney and wasting fuel. The level of the kerosene in the reservoir was checked daily, a visible gauge of your remaining light. Therefore, your evenings were not free time, but carefully budgeted segments of visibility. You might gather the family to share a single lantern's glow to maximize its utility. Conversation happened in the near dark, faces half lit by the dancing flame. When the last light was extinguished, there was nothing left to do but retire. The night was not for living, but for waiting. You went to bed not necessarily because you were tired, but because the fundamental resource required for any other activity, light, had been e. Chapter 18. The Itch of Wool, Universal Long Underwear. Against the cold, both the pervasive damp chill and the biting winter freeze, there was one primary line of defense, wool. And not merely as an outer layer, but as a constant Tiesun presence. The foundation of nearly every wardrobe, for men, women, and children, was long underwear made of coarse, untreated wool. It was a second skin that was anything but comfortable. The fabric was thick and scratchy. It was not the soft merino of later years, but a utilitarian weave from hardy frontier sheep, often retaining traces of lanolin and vegetal matter. When new, it was stiff and could chafe the skin, particularly at the seams under the arms and behind the knees. With wear and infrequent washing, it would soften slightly, but never lose its essential prickliness. You wore it every day from first frost until late spring. Dressing in the morning meant pulling on these woolen leggings and long-sleeve tops, a daily negotiation with discomfort. The itch was a constant, low-level distraction, a background hum on the skin that flared with movement or sweat. On a long, monotonous day of riding or walking, it could become a maddening focus. A seam rubbing the same patch of skin for hours, a tag at the neck that could not be ignored. Yet, its virtues were undeniable. Wool retained heat even when damp from rain, snow, or sweat. It was durable, resisting tears from brush and thorns. And it was a barrier against the wind that no cotton could match. You endured the itch because the alternative, the penetrating cold, was a greater, more dangerous misery. Thus, your sensory experience of the frontier was inextricably linked to this persistent, abrasive whisper against your body, a reminder that basic protection was never without its price, paid in the constant subtle currency of irritation. Chapter 19. Laundry. The boiling kettle and lye soap. The accumulation of dirt, sweat, and the grime of daily labor presented a problem of profound inconvenience. Laundry was not a weekly chore, but a formidable, semi-regular expedition into the realm of boiling water and harsh chemistry. The process was so labor-intensive that it was often delayed until absolutely necessary, or until a rare day of abundant water and fuel presented itself. It began with the soap, Commercially made soap was a luxury. More commonly, you used lye soap, made at home from rendered animal fat and lye leached from wood ashes. This soap was abrasive and caustic, effective at cutting through grease and ground in dirt, but punishing on the skin and the fabric itself. It had a harsh, alkaline smell. The physical labor was exhaustive. Water had to be hauled in buckets from its source, a creek, a well, a spring, and heated in a large kettle over a fire you maintained for hours. The clothes and linens were then agitated in this scalding, soapy water with a wooden paddle, a process that steamed the face and strained the arms. Heavy work clothes, stiff with dried sweat and dirt, required vigorous pounding and scrubbing against a washboard, a corrugated metal board that further tested the fabric's integrity. Rinsing required more hauled water, often in a separate tub, to remove the soap residue. Wringing out the heavy, waterlogged fabric by hand was a taxing effort, demanding significant grip strength. Finally, the items were hung to dry on lines or draped over bushes, subject now to the whims of the weather and the ever-present dust. A full day could be consumed by this single task, leaving you as weary as from field work. Consequently, the frontier was not a place of crisp, clean linens. Clothing was worn for extended periods, the woolens aired out but rarely washed in winter. The faint, lingering sense of wood smoke, animal, and honest sweat were simply part of the atmosphere. The olfactory sig. Chapter 20 Footwear. The inevitability of wet socks. The condition of your feet could dictate the success or failure of a day, a journey, a season. And the primary point of vulnerability, the universal experience, was not the boot leather failing, but the persistent, inescapable reality of wet socks. Keeping your feet dry was a logistical battle almost always lost. Footwear was typically a stout leather boot, often knee-high for riding and protection. The leather, while treated with oils or tallow, was not waterproof. A morning walk through dew-heavy grass would seep moisture through the seams. A creek crossing, even a shallow one, guaranteed saturation. A sudden rainstorm turned the ground to mud, which clung to the boots and eventually worked its way in. There was no synthetic barrier, no breathable membrane. When the outside was wet, the inside became damp, and your socks bore the full consequence. Wool socks were the standard, prized for their warmth even when wet, but this was a relative comfort. A sodden wool sock lost its cushioning, becoming a heavy, wrinkled mass that chafed with every step. The sensation was a cold, squelching squeeze, a reminder of discomfort with each footfall. If you were walking miles, this damp friction could raise blisters with alarming speed, transforming a simple journey into a painful ordeal. At day's end, the ritual was the same. Peeling off the damp boots, then the even damper socks. You would wring them out, feeling the cold water between your fingers, and place them near the fire to dry, but not too close, lest they scorch or stiffen into unwearable shapes. The leather boots themselves required careful maintenance, stuffed with dry grass or paper to draw out the moisture, then rubbed with more tallow to preserve the leather. It was a cycle of saturation and reclamation, a daily admission that your foundation was perpetually compromised. Your mobility, your most basic freedom, was forever tempered by this damp, chafing limit. Chapter 21. Dentistry. A brief and distressing overview. The management of pain, particularly chronic, localized pain, was a defining frontier experience. And no source was more common, more relentless, or more poorly addressed than dental distress. The simple toothache, a minor nuisance in the modern world, could escalate on the frontier into a dominating, life-altering agony, addressed with methods that were themselves traumatic. Preventive care was virtually non-existent. Diets high in coarse grains and sugar, when available, contributed to rapid decay. There were no fluoride treatments, no routine cleanings. You became aware of a problem only when it began. A faint, dull sensitivity to heat or cold, a tender sensation when chewing. This would often bloom, over days or weeks, into a persistent, throbbing ache. The pain was isolating and consuming, sharpening with every heartbeat, making concentration on any other task impossible. Professional help, where it existed at all, was rudimentary. A dentist might be a traveling practitioner whose tools were little different from a blacksmith's or a barber's. The primary solution for a severely decayed or abscessed tooth was extraction. This was a brutal, mechanical procedure. The most common instrument was the dental key, a claw-like device that was hooked over the top of the tooth. With a twisting motion, the tooth was pried and levered from its socket, often taking pieces of bone and gum tissue with it. The sound and sensation were unforgettable. Anesthesia, if used, might be a swig of whiskey, which did little to numb the pain but perhaps clouded the memory. For those without access to even this grim service, the options were dire. You might attempt self-extraction with pliers, risking breakage and infection. Or you might simply endure, the pain becoming a constant companion. Its slow, pulsing rhythm dictating your mood and eroding your health as infection spread. The state of your teeth was not a matter of COSM. Chapter 22. Medicinal Practices. Whiskey and Opiate Syrups. When illness or injury struck beyond the realm of dentistry, you entered a world of therapeutic guesswork, where the line between remedy and intoxicant was faint and often non-existent. The frontier medical kit was not defined by precision, but by the need to alter the patient's subjective experience of suffering by any means available. The most universal, all-purpose medicament was alcohol, typically in the form of whiskey or raw grain spirits. Its applications were broad. It was an antiseptic for wounds, poured onto lacerations or abrasions with predictably fiery results. It was a painkiller, consumed internally to dull the senses before a painful procedure or to take the edge off chronic aches. It was a stimulant for shock and a supposed febrifuge for fevers. Its primary, reliable effect was inebriation, which at least provided a temporary dissociation from distress. For more persistent or severe complaints, the turn was to patent medicines. These were commercially produced, widely advertised tonics and syrups, sold in general stores and from the backs of wagons. Their most active and effective ingredients were invariably opiates. Morphine and, later, heroin, freely mixed into pleasant-tasting syrups. Products like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup for Teething Children or McMunn's Elixir for Coughs promised relief and delivered a powerful narcotic effect. They quieted coughs, stilled diarrhea, and induced a profound, addictive calm. The diagnosis behind their use was often vague. Ague, neuralgia, consumption, or general debility were catch-all terms for a spectrum of suffering. The treatment, however, was consistent. Sedation. Whether from alcohol or opium, the goal was not to cure the underlying pathology, which was rarely understood, but to render the patient quiet and manageable, to ease the perceived burden of the illness on both the sufferer and those around them. Healing was a passé. Chapter 23. Common Ailments. Ague, fever, and general malaise. Beyond the reach of toothaches and injuries treatable by whiskey, there existed a broad, vague category of chronic discomfort. These were the ailments that lacked clear cause or dramatic crisis, but which colored daily life with a persistent, draining patina of unwellness. They were often grouped under nonspecific, poetic terms like ague or the slows. Ague was a classic example. It did not refer to a single disease, but to a cyclical pattern of symptoms, most commonly associated with malaria in swampy regions, but applied to any recurring fever and chills. One day you might be functional, the next gripped by a bone-deep chill no fire could touch, your teeth chattering uncontrollably. This would break into a drenching sweat and a pounding fever, leaving you weak and exhausted. Then, just as suddenly, it might lift, only to return days or weeks later with the same wearying rhythm. It was an illness without a clear beginning or end, a recurring ghost in your system. Fever was another catch-all, describing everything from typhoid to undiagnosed infections. But more common than these acute states was a general, lingering malaise. A persistent fatigue that made heavy chores feel impossible. Aches in the joints, especially in damp weather. A digestive system perpetually unsettled by poor water and monotonous food. You were rarely well in the sense of vibrant health. You were, instead, in a state of functional convalescence, operating at a fraction of your capacity. This baseline of low-grade illness was accepted as normal. It was the physical cost of the life itself, the poor nutrition, the contaminated water, the constant exposure, the mental strain. You did not seek a cure, for there was none to be had. You simply adjusted your expectations of what a day's work could be, and carried the familiar weight of general malaise with you, as constant and unremarkable as the wool on your back or the dust in. Chapter 24, Communication, the slowness of the postal system. In an era defined by instant connection, it is difficult to comprehend the profound isolation enforced by the pace of communication. Your link to the world you left behind, to family, to news, to the very progression of events, was not severed, but stretched to an agonizing thinness. It traveled at the speed of a horse, a coach, or a steamship, and was subject to countless delays. The postal system was a fragile, intermittent thread. In settled areas, a weekly mail delivery was a luxury. In remote districts, it could be monthly, or dependent on the arrival of a supply wagon whose primary mission was not the mail. Letters did not travel alone. They waited. They waited in a sack at a stagecoach station for the next rider. They waited on a dock for a steamboat that was delayed by low water. They waited at a territorial capital for enough volume to justify sending a carrier to your region. This meant that correspondence was a conversation separated by vast gulfs of time. A letter sent from you in the Dakota Territory in November, inquiring after a sick relative, might not receive a reply until the following April, by which time the relative's fate had long been sealed. News of a presidential election, a financial panic, or the outbreak of a war could take weeks or even months to reach you, rendering you a citizen of a country whose current state was a mystery. You lived, therefore, in two timelines. There was the immediate, local timeline of your daily labor and the seasons, and there was the distant, suspended timeline of back home, which existed for you in a state of perpetual delay. A letter, when it finally arrived, was not current news. It was a historical document, a window into a past that was already receding. The act of writing back was an exercise in speaking into a void, unsure if your words would find their recipient in the same world, or even the same circumstances in which you wrote them. Chapter 25, Literacy Rates and the Circulation of Newspapers. The slowness of the mail was compounded by another, more fundamental barrier. Not everyone could read it. Literacy, while higher in America than in many parts of the world, was not universal on the frontier. The ability to fluently read and write was a skill often left behind with formal schooling, a luxury of a more settled life. In a rough mining camp or on an isolated homestead, your education was what you carried in your head. For those who could read, the newspaper was a treasure, a fragile paper conduit to the wider world. But a newspaper was never news in the sense of current events. By the time a paper from St. Louis, Chicago, or San Francisco reached a remote outpost, it was weeks, often months, old. Its reports were of a past that had already been reshaped by subsequent, unreported events. Yet its value was immense. It was read exhaustively, from the front-page political speeches to the shipping news and the advertisements for patent medicines and farm equipment. The paper was passed from hand to hand, read aloud in groups at a general store or a saloon, becoming a communal event. For the illiterate listener, this was a primary source of information, filtered through the voice and interpretation of the reader. The paper was so precious it was rarely discarded. It became insulation in walls, wrapping for parcels, or kindling only after every word had been absorbed. The information itself existed in layers of increasing obsolescence. You had your immediate sensory reality. You had the slightly stale news from the nearest territorial capital, perhaps a week old. And you had the ancient, formal pronouncements from the East, discussing legislative acts that may have already been superseded. Your understanding of the world was therefore a patchwork of different pasts, with no reliable way to know which piece was still relevant. You were informed, but perpetually out of date, making decisions base. Chapter 27, Barter Systems. From Eggs to Pelts. When currency was untrustworthy or absent, the economy reverted to its most ancient form, the direct trade of goods and services. This was not a simple swap, but a complex, ongoing negotiation of relative value, where your wealth was not in a pocket but in the tangible products of your labor and the land around you. The medium of exchange was anything with inherent utility. A ranch wife might bring a basket of eggs or a crock of butter to the general store, trading them for a length of calico or a pound of coffee. A hunter's deer hide or a trapper's bundle of beaver pelts could be exchanged for ammunition, flour, or a new knife. A day's labor mending a fence might be repaid with a side of bacon or a promise of future help with your own roof. This system required a deep, localized knowledge of worth. How many eggs equaled a pound of nails? Was a bushel of apples a fair trade for having a horse shod? These values fluctuated with season and scarcity. In spring, eggs might be plentiful and less valuable. In late winter, a single dozen could be a small fortune. A good pelt was worth more before it became motley in the spring molt. Barter also created webs of reciprocal obligation that bound small communities together. Debt was not merely financial, but social. If you accepted a neighbor's help branding cattle, you owed them a debt measured in time and skill, to be repaid when they needed an extra hand for harvest. This created a sturdy, interpersonal safety net, but it also meant your independence was always tempered by what you owed and what was owed to you. Your economic life was a continuous, quiet conversation of need and provision, conducted not with money, but with the very stuff of your daily existence. Chapter 26. Currency. A confusing array of script and coin. The practical matter of conducting trade, of buying a sack of flour or paying for a blacksmith's work, was fraught with its own peculiar uncertainty. There was no single, trusted currency. Instead, you navigated a bewildering ecosystem of value, a tangible lesson in provisional economics. Hard coin was rare and prized. Spanish silver dollars, known as pieces of 8, and their fractional cuts, bits, circulated widely, their value recognized from Texas to Montana. U.S. gold coins, eagles and double eagles, were seen but often hoarded. More common was a chaotic mix of foreign coins. French, English, Mexican, all accepted by weight and metal content rather than face value, requiring a small scale at any merchant's counter. But specie was scarce. More often, trade happened on credit, recorded as entries in a ledger, a system known as script. Your account at the general store, your wages from the ranch, might exist only as handwritten notations. This script was only as good as the trustworthiness and solvency of the issuer. If a store went bankrupt, your script became worthless paper. A ranch hand might be paid in script redeemable only at the company store, often at inflated prices, a system that bound him to his employer. Furthermore, banks were few, distant, and notoriously unstable. A banknote from an institution in one state or territory might be viewed with deep suspicion or heavily discounted in another. Counterfeiting was rampant, and the average person had little means to detect a well-made fake. Therefore, every transaction required a moment of calculus and trust. You had to judge the authenticity of a coin, the reliability of a promissory note, or the long-term prospects of the merchant holding your script. Your wealth was not a solid number in an account, but a fragile network of promises and metal, vulnerable to distance, distrust, and the frequent financial panics that rippled months late. Chapter 28. The price fluctuation of basic commodities. Within the systems of barter and shaky currency, the cost of the items necessary for survival was not fixed. It was a volatile equation, subject to forces both visible and distant. The price of a barrel of flour or a pound of coffee in a frontier settlement was a direct reflection of its isolation, and could swing from merely expensive to prohibitive based on factors entirely beyond your control. The primary driver was transportation. Any item not produced locally had to be freighted in, often over hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. A washed-out bridge, a band of rustlers on a trail, or low water in a river that halted steamboats could interrupt supply for weeks. When the next wagon train finally arrived, the merchant, having borne the risk and delay, would adjust his prices accordingly. A commodity that cost $1 in St. Louis could easily cost $5 or $10 in a Montana mining camp. Season played a brutal role. In late winter or early spring, when trails were muddy or snowed in and local reserves were depleted, prices would spike. A sack of beans that was affordable in the autumn might become a luxury item by March. This demanded intense planning and forethought. A failure to lay in enough supplies before the first snow could mean facing spring with ruinous costs or outright scarcity. Furthermore, the boom and bust cycle of mining towns created extreme inflation almost overnight. The discovery of a rich vein would draw thousands. The sudden, massive demand for every basic good would outstrip supply, and prices would skyrocket. A meal and a bed could cost a day's wage from a played-out claim. Then, when the boom faded, prices might collapse, but so would the economy, leaving behind a different kind of scarcity. Thus, your ability to feed yourself was tied not just to your own labor, but to the weather 1,000 miles away, the fortunes of a mine you didn't work, and the condition of a road why. Chapter 29. The Social Hierarchy of a Mining Camp. In a mining camp, the stark pursuit of wealth forged a social order that was both brutally simple and intensely fluid. It was a hierarchy based not on birth or lasting reputation, but on a volatile combination of luck, immediate utility, and sheer force of personality. Your position within it could change with the contents of a single pan. At the top stood the successful claim holders. Not necessarily the first discoverers, who were often quickly bought out or muscled aside, but those who controlled proven, yielding ground. Their power was economic, measured in ounces of dust and nuggets. They often became the de facto bankers, merchants, and lawgivers, their word carrying the weight of their purse. Just below were the essential artisans. The assayer, whose crucible pronounced judgment on a man's hopes. The blacksmith, who kept tools functional. And the saloon-keeper, who provided the primary relief from toil. Their wealth was more stable than the miners, derived from servicing the dream rather than chasing it. The vast majority formed the laboring base, the miners themselves. They worked their own meager claims or hired out as day laborers for the claim holders. Their lives a cycle of backbreaking diggings, uncertain yields, and hopeful speculation. Their status was perpetually provisional, one strike away from ascent or ruin. At the bottom, yet often wielding a different kind of power, were those outside the mineral economy. Cooks, laundresses, and the women of the dance halls and brothels. They provided necessary services in a profoundly male world, often accumulating quiet savings from the miners' transient wealth. This hierarchy was constantly churning. A lucky strike could propel a laborer to the top in an afternoon. A claim that played out could see a man descend just as quickly. It created an atmosphere of frenetic speculation and deep-seated anxiety, where every man was assessed for his current worth. Chapter 30. The administrative tedium of a cattle drive. The cattle drive is often pictured as a sweeping, cinematic journey. The reality for the cowboy was defined not by drama, but by a crushing, meticulous routine. A slow-moving exercise in administrative tedium conducted on horseback under an endless sky. The herd itself was a fragile, walking asset, and its management required a strict, unchanging protocol. Each man had his assigned position: point, swing, flank, drag. The drag position, eating the dust of 2,000 hooves, was the least desirable, often given to the greenest hand. The days were not marked by events, but by the methodical execution of duty. You rose in the dark for the same breakfast. You took your position as the herd stirred. Your job was to maintain the slow, plodding momentum, to prevent the cattle from bunching or stringing out too far, to gently turn back any strayers that edged from the mass. The primary enemy was not rustlers or stampedes, but boredom and minor irritation. The cattle moved at a walk about 10 to 12 miles a day. You would spend 10 to 12 hours in the saddle, at that same walk, watching the same sea of backs, listening to the constant lowing, the clack of horns, the creak of your saddle. The landscape changed with geological slowness. At night, you drew watch duty. 2-hour shifts, circling the bedded-down herd in the profound darkness, your senses tuned for any shift in the pattern of their breathing, any collective restlessness. It was lonely, monotonous work, a battle against sleep in the cool night air, your world reduced to the circle of your vision and the soft sounds of chewing cuds. This was not a life of adventure, but of disciplined, repetitive labor. Your success was measured by the absence of incident. A good day was a boring day. The paperwork of the drive, the daily count, the maintenance of equipment, the careful husbanding of supplies, was mirrored in the physical paperwork of keeping the he. Chapter 32. Legal jurisdictions, often unclear and contested. In a landscape of shifting borders and overlapping claims, the question of who had the authority to enforce the law was often as murky as a prairie creek after a rain. You did not live under a single, clear jurisdiction, but in a patchwork of contested authority, where the reach of the law was theoretical until it was violently enforced. A location might be claimed by one county, but actually administered by another, simply because the seat of the latter was closer. The boundaries of federal territories were fluid, and where one territory ended and another began was sometimes a matter of argument. This ambiguity created zones of disputed authority, places where no sheriff, marshal, or judge felt unequivocally responsible, or where multiple officials claimed the right to act. This was especially true in areas where older communal land grants from Spanish or Mexican rule conflicted with the newer rectangular survey system of the United States. A dispute over property could hinge on which legal tradition, which nation's old paperwork, was considered valid. The correct court might be 100 miles away, in a language you didn't speak. For the individual, this meant uncertainty. If you were victimized, to whom did you report? If you were accused, who had the right to arrest you? The answer could depend on the political connections of your accuser or the personal ambition of a local constable. Law was not an abstract system of justice, but a localized, often personal power. Your safety and liberty could hinge on the obscure, ever-shifting lines on a map in some distant capital, lines that meant nothing to the land itself, and everything to the men who invoked them. Chapter 31. The Boredom of the Line Shack. Isolation took its most concentrated form in the line shack. This was a small, crude cabin, often just a single room, placed on the remote boundary of a vast ranch. Here, one or two cowboys would spend the winter months, tasked not with driving cattle, but with simply watching over them, an exercise in profound solitude and inertia. Your duty was preventative, to ride the line of the fence, if one existed, or the natural boundaries of the range, to look for strayed or trapped cattle, to break ice on water holes, and to scare away predators. But for weeks at a time, blizzards would ground you completely. You would be snowed in, the world reduced to the four walls of the shack and a howling white void beyond the door. The shack itself was Spartan. A stove, a bunk, a small table, perhaps a shelf for a few books or a worn deck of cards. Supplies were dropped off infrequently. Your company was your own, or that of a single partner, with whom you would exhaust all conceivable conversation within the first fortnight. The silence, when the wind wasn't screaming, was absolute and heavy. Days were structured around the minimal chores necessary for survival. Melting snow for water, feeding the stove, caring for your horse in its lean-to. The rest was empty time. You might read the same almanac or newspaper for the 10th time. You might whittle a piece of wood down to nothing. You would stare out the single, frost-rimed window at the unchanging monochrome landscape. The mind, deprived of stimulus, would turn in on itself, fixating on small irritations or old memories. The challenge was not physical labor, but mental endurance. The struggle against a creeping lethargy of the spirit, a boredom so deep it became a tangible presence in the room, a third, silent occupant in the line shack. Chapter 33. Dispute Resolution. A spectrum of formality. In the absence of clear or accessible legal authority, the resolution of conflicts existed along a broad spectrum, ranging from quiet negotiation to sudden, irrevocable violence. Most disputes, contrary to legend, never reached for a gun. They simmered, were argued, or were settled through community pressure, because the alternative was often more costly than the original grievance. At the most formal end was the impromptu citizens' court or miners' meeting. In a camp or a remote settlement without an appointed judge, respected elders or simply a majority of the assembled men might hear a case. A claim of theft, a boundary dispute, a question of a debt. Evidence was presented, witnesses spoke, and a verdict was rendered, which could range from restitution to banishment. This was democracy in its rawest form, but it was vulnerable to mob sentiment and personal rivalries. More common were the semi-formal interventions of community figures. A preacher, a trusted storekeeper, or an experienced rancher might be asked to mediate between two parties. Their authority stemmed not from a badge, but from their perceived fairness and their standing in the community. They would listen, suggest a compromise, perhaps splitting the difference on a contested cow, or defining a property line with a visible rock pile. But underpinning all of this was the unspoken potential for personal action. When all other avenues were exhausted, or when a man felt his honor or survival was directly threatened, the dispute resolved itself privately. This was not the structured duel of fiction, but a sudden, desperate eruption, or a long-simmering feud settled in a moment of confrontation. The law, when it finally arrived, would often be presented with a fait accompli, a body and a story, and would then engage in the difficult work of determining whether what had occurred was murder or a form of rough, extralegal justice. Your recourse in a CONF. Chapter 34. The reality of livestock theft, mostly a civil matter. The iconic crime of the West, cattle rustling, was rarely the dramatic, nocturnal adventure of lore. In practice, it was often a murky, slow-moving issue of property law, a civil dispute before it was a criminal one. The primary reason was the nature of the asset itself. Cattle wandered, mixed with herds from other ranches, and were difficult to positively identify once separated from their home range. The central point of contention was the brand. But brands could be altered: a V, turned into a W, a circle, added to a bar. This was running an iron, a skilled and secretive crime. Proving it, however, required catching the thief in the act with the altered animal, or finding the original scarred hide, which was rarely preserved. More common than outright theft were disputes over ownership of strays. In the open range before barbed wire, cattle from multiple ranches would intermingle. The seasonal roundup was a massive sorting operation, based on brands and earmarks. It was here that discrepancies emerged. A rancher might claim a cow bearing a blurred or unfamiliar brand as his own, arguing it was a sleeper he'd missed in previous years. The other rancher would naturally disagree. These conflicts were often handled between the ranches themselves, through negotiation or the threat of economic retaliation, long before a sheriff was involved. Invoking the law was a last resort, as it required time, travel, and often yielded unsatisfactory results due to lack of evidence. Violence did occur, famously in the range wars, but these were typically large-scale economic conflicts over grazing rights and market access, not the theft of a few head. For the average cowboy or smallholder, a missing steer was more likely to lead to a weeks-long argument and a tense meeting than a gunfight. The real damage was economic and persistent, a slow bleed of assets rather than a single violent loss. Chapter 35. Fire. The ever-present urban hazard. Within the fragile, burgeoning towns of the West, a menace more relentless than any outlaw stalked the streets, one that respected no social hierarchy and could undo years of labor in a single roaring hour. This was fire. In settlements built predominantly of wood, canvas, and dried timber, with inadequate water supplies and volunteer fire brigades armed with little more than buckets and determination, fire was not a risk, it was an eventual certainty. Your entire existence within a town was lived under its silent, looming threat. The conditions for catastrophe were meticulously assembled by daily life. Buildings were constructed flush against one another, sharing walls or separated by mere alleyways, creating perfect avenues for flames to leap. Roofs were of wooden shingle or, worse, of tar paper and sawdust. The primary heating source in every structure, from the grandest hotel to the humblest dwelling, was a wood or coal-burning stove, its flue running up through a framework of desiccated lumber. A single overcharged stove, a toppled lantern, a carelessly tossed cigarillo, or the simple accumulation of greasy soot in a chimney could provide the first, irredeemable spark. Once ignited, a fire found a feast of fuel. The general store stocked barrels of flour, kegs of gunpowder, and tins of coal oil. The saloon had its reserves of high-proof alcohol. The livery stable held hay and grain. The very sidewalks and roadways, often made of wooden planks, could become a burning causeway. And against this, the defenses were pathetically human. The cry of fire would ring out, triggering a desperate, chaotic symphony of church bells and shouted orders. Citizens would form brittle bucket brigades, passing leather pails hand over hand from a creek or a dug cistern, a pathetic trickle of water against a towering wall of heat. The fire's path was decided by the wind. A favoring breeze could carry embers across wide streets. Chapter 36. Sanitation. Open ditches and their drawbacks. Beneath the wooden sidewalks and dusty streets of a frontier town ran a quieter, more insidious network, the open sewer ditch. This was the fundamental and fundamentally flawed sanitation system for most burgeoning settlements. Waste, from household slops to the effluent of saloons and butcher shops, was carried by these shallow, uncovered trenches that paralleled the main thoroughfares. Their purpose was simple: to convey filth away from the populated center, ideally to a creek or ravine on the outskirts. In practice, they created a pervasive, low-grade miasma that defined the sensory experience of urban life and posed a constant threat to public health. The ditches were rarely engineered. They were simply gouged into the earth, following the natural, shallow gradient of the land. Their flow was not constant but depended entirely on the weather. In dry periods, they became stagnant troughs, filled with a thickening, fermenting sludge that baked in the sun. This produced a complex, layered odor that hung in the air, especially on still, hot afternoons. It was a smell composed of rotting organic matter, human waste, and the sharp, acrid tang of lye soap and ammonia from laundry water. With rain, the ditches transformed. A downpour would flush them, but often inadequately, stirring up the accumulated waste and carrying it only a short distance before the water soaked into the ground, leaving a fresh deposit of muck. In a heavy storm, they could overflow their banks, spreading their contents into streets, yards, and sometimes, via seepage, into shallow wells. This direct contamination of water sources was a primary vector for the typhoid and cholera that periodically swept through communities. The ditches also served as a habitat and highway for vermin. Rats moved freely along these damp corridors, and clouds of flies bred in the nutrient-rich muck, transferring pathogens from the waste to foodstuffs in the O. Chapter 37. Livestock in streets. An ordnance compliance issue. The open range did not neatly end at the town limits. Livestock, the foundation of the local economy, was also a persistent, ambulatory feature of daily urban life. Cattle, hogs, horses, and mules roamed freely through the streets, a living, lowing, and often obstinate form of traffic that rendered the very concept of a sidewalk a necessary, elevated refuge. This was not mere neglect. It was a deeply ingrained practice, and the struggle to contain it was one of the West's quiet, ongoing civic battles. For residents, this meant constant vigilance. A trip to the general store involved navigating around dozing cows seeking shade against a building, sidestepping piles of manure, and shooing curious hogs from the boardwalk. Unfenced gardens were a buffet for wandering animals. The sound of clattering hooves and the calls of drovers herding stock down the main street was as common as conversation. The animals themselves were not pets. They were large, sometimes temperamental property, and a direct encounter with a protective steer or a spooked horse could be dangerous. The primary issue was one of conflicting priorities. Ranchers and teamsters saw the town as an extension of the range, a place where animals could be left to graze on vacant lots or public land, while their owners conducted business. They resented any restriction as an infringement on their livelihood. Townspeople, particularly merchants and homemakers, saw the animals as a nuisance, a health hazard, and a detriment to orderly commerce. This tension led to a cycle of weak ordinances and spotty enforcement. A town council might pass a law requiring livestock to be kept penned or demanding that owners be responsible for damages. But the position of town marshal was often poorly paid and politically delicate. Strictly enforcing stock laws against influential local ranchers was a quick path to unemployment. So, enforcement was often selective. Chapter 38. The acoustics of a boomtown: constant hammering. The soundscape of a frontier boomtown was not one of dramatic shootouts or boisterous saloon music, though those occurred. The dominant, pervasive audio texture was industrial, a relentless, day-long percussion of construction. It was the sound of a raw settlement hammering itself into existence, and it offered no respite. From first light, the cacophony began. The most constant sound was the hammer, dozens, scores of hammers, striking in a rhythmic unison. The solid thwack of a framing hammer driving nails into fresh-cut lumber. The sharper clink of a blacksmith's hammer shaping hot iron on an anvil, a metallic heartbeat at the town's core. The heavy, splitting thud of a sledgehammer driving posts for new corrals or sidewalk foundations. This was layered with the rasp of handsaws and the shrill, grating whine of whipsaws, as logs were ripped into planks. The groan of wagon axles, overloaded with timber or stone, created a low, complaining bass note over the rutted streets. From the carpentry shops came the rhythmic scraping of planes smoothing wood, and the high-speed zip-zip-zip of a drawknife shaping a spoke. There were no quiet hours. As one crew finished for the day, the night shift for a stamp mill or a mine on the outskirts might begin, adding the distant, monotonous thump of heavy machinery to the nocturnal mix. Even in relative stillness, the new buildings themselves contributed. Green timber, drying and contracting in the sun and wind, would pop and creak like the joints of a settling giant. This auditory assault was inescapable. It vibrated in your teeth, made conversation a shouted affair, and rendered the notion of peaceful concentration a fantasy. It was the sound of prosperity, but also of profound disorder. There was no zoning, no noise ordinance. The blacksmith might be next to the hotel, the livery stable beside the church. You lived and worked inside a great sprawling workshop where, Chapter 40, the dust permeation of all personal effects. Dust was more than an element of the landscape. It was a fine, particulate atmosphere that adhered to the principle of inevitable infiltration. It did not respect barriers of cloth, wood, or leather. Its ultimate destination was the interior of every container, the weave of every fabric, and the mechanism of every tool. The management of dust was not a periodic chore, but a constant losing campaign fought on every domestic front. Inside a dwelling, dust settled with a quiet persistence. It coated shelves and tabletops with a soft, gray film within hours of wiping. It sifted between the pages of a book, leaving a gritty texture on the paper. It found its way into food stores. Even a tightly lidded tin might, upon opening, reveal a fine silt along its rim. You would taste it in your meals, a faint, earthy grit between your molars, an unavoidable seasoning. Your clothing was perpetually infused with it. Wool and canvas held the dust deep in their fibers. Beating a coat or a blanket would raise a cloud, but never fully evacuate it. The sensation of pulling on a shirt was often one of slight abrasion, the dust having worked its way into the very thread. In your pockets, a fine residue would mix with tobacco, coins, or scraps of paper, creating a granular paste. Mechanical objects suffered profoundly. The workings of a rifle, a pocket watch, or a sewing machine were vulnerable. Dust acted as an abrasive, grinding at fine gears and pivots, could foul a firearm's action, leading to misfires. It blurred optical lenses and clouded mirror surfaces. Maintaining any precision instrument required frequent, meticulous disassembly and cleaning with precious oils, only to have the dust return with the next gust of wind. This permeation created a state of perpetual slight decay. Nothing ever felt truly clean, new, or pristine. Your possessions aged rapidly, worn not by use alone, but by the endless, gentle sandblasting. Chapter 39. Sleep Disruption. Nocturnal Animals and Their Calls. When the last hammer fell into silence and the final saloon piano ceased, a different, older symphony began. The night, far from being a realm of quiet rest, was alive with a chorus of wild voices. For the weary soul seeking sleep, these sounds were not picturesque nature studies. They were a series of abrupt, startling, and often unnerving interruptions that frayed the edges of consciousness. The most common alarm was the coyote. Their vocalizations were not the lone, romantic howl of legend, but a chaotic social event. It would begin with a series of high, yipping barks from one point in the darkness, answered by another, then another. This would build into a cacophonous, laughing wail, a yodeling, shrieking chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once, rising and falling in waves. Just as you'd grown accustomed to it and begun to drift, it would cut off with jarring suddenness, leaving a silence more startling than the noise. Owls contributed a punctuated grammar to the dark. The deep, resonant hoo-hoo-hoo of the great horned owl was a somber, distant tolling. The barn owl's shriek, however, was a sound of pure nightmare. A raw, rasping screech that could jolt you upright, heart pounding, convinced something dreadful was happening just outside your door. Smaller creatures played their parts. The rustle of a pack rat in the sod roof or between the cabin walls was a continuous, skittering whisper, suggesting stealthy movement inches from your head. Bats, if they colonized an eave, produced a faint, chittering buzz. On the plains, the wind itself became a nocturnal animal, keening through cracks in the chinking, whistling under the door, a constant, restless breath. For the solitary homesteader or the traveler camped alone, these sounds were magnified by imagination. Every snapped twig could be a predator. Every odd cry could signal danger. Sleep became a shallow, fitful state, a cautious. Chapter 41. The repetitive nature of agricultural labor. For those who sought stability in the soil rather than fortune in a mine, the rhythm of life was dictated by an ancient, cyclical repetition. The work was not one of dramatic events, but of countless, identical motions, performed under the sun, the wind, and the vast, indifferent sky. Each season presented its own set of tasks, but the essence was the same. A slow, physical persuasion of the earth, demanding the same actions, day after day. In spring, it was the breaking of the sod. Walking behind a plow pulled by oxen or horses, you would grip the handles, feeling the share bite and turn the dense, matted earth. Your world narrowed to the straightness of the furrow ahead, the smell of damp soil and crushed grass roots, the strain in your shoulders and back as you fought to keep the blade at the correct depth. The field was measured not in acres, but in the number of passes, each one mirroring the last. When not plowing, you were planting, a slow walk up and down the rows, dropping seed by hand into the furrow, your movements a steady, metronomic stoop and straighten. Summer brought cultivation and the war against weeds. With a hoe, you would walk the rows again, the blades slicing at the base of invasive plants, a battle against a green, persistent enemy that grew faster than your crops. The motion, lift, swing, chop, was repeated thousands of times a day. There was irrigation, if you were lucky, which meant moving heavy canvas hose or digging diversion ditches, another form of moving earth and water. Autumn was the harvest, the culmination of the year's toil. For grains, it was the swing of a scythe or cradle, a wide, arcing motion that cut the stalks, followed by the binding of sheaves. For corn, it was the repetitive pull and twist of the ear from the stalk, the prickle of the husk on your hands. The work was urgent but methodical, a race against weather, but its components were as monotonous as those of S. Chapter 42. Blacksmithing. The heat and the repetitive striking. At the heart of any functioning settlement, providing its essential metallic sinew, was the blacksmith's forge. To step inside was to enter a realm of elemental sensation, a place where utility was born from a punishing, repetitive alliance of fire, muscle, and iron. The work was not one of sudden inspiration, but of patient, percussive ritual, and the blacksmith's day was a cycle of heating, hammering, and tempering that left its mark on both the metal and the man. The forge itself was a maw of contained hellfire. Fed by a hand-cranked bellows, the bed of coke or coal glowed a deep, searing orange, capable of rendering iron to a malleable, glowing yellow. The heat was not a gentle warmth, but a solid, radiating wall that pressed against the skin of the face and chest. A dry, sucking heat that parched the throat and drew sweat that evaporated instantly. In summer, the shop was an oven. In winter, a pocket of shocking contrast between the forge's fury and the frozen air at one's back. The core action was the strike. The blacksmith would draw a glowing billet from the fire with tongs, transfer it to the anvil, a massive horned block of steel, and begin to shape it. The hammer, an extension of his arm, would fall in a precise, rhythmic pattern. Clang. Pause. Turn the metal. Clang. Pause. Turn. Each strike had purpose. To draw out the metal, to flatten it, to bend it to a specific angle. The sound was a sharp, ringing report that echoed in the confined space, a metallic heartbeat. For a simple nail, this might be a dozen strikes. For a tool or a wheel rim, it could be hundreds, the metal requiring repeated returns to the fire as it cooled and hardened. The air was thick with the smells of scorched coal, hot metal, and the tang of quenching oil or water. When a piece was finished to shape, it was plunged into a bucket with a fierce hiss and a bloom of acrid steam. The final product, a horseshoe, a hinge. Chapter 43, The Mending of Fences, a Philosophical Exercise. Following the labor of building came the perpetual, contemplative task of maintenance, and nothing embodied this more than the mending of fences. Particularly after the advent of barbed wire, which carved the open range into private properties, fence mending evolved from a chore into a slow, solitary meditation on boundaries, ownership, and the relentless pressure of the wild. The causes of damage were varied and constant. Winter frost could heave posts from the ground, leaving lines sagging. Heavy, wet snow could bow or snap wires. Livestock, especially cattle, would lean against the fence, seeking the grass on the other side, or rub an itch, gradually loosening staples and straining the wire until it snapped with a sharp, musical twang. Fallen trees from windstorms created catastrophic, tangled breaches. The work itself was methodical and quiet. You would walk the line, a spool of wire over your shoulder, a hammer and a pair of fencing pliers in your hand. Finding a break, you would first disentangle the snarled ends, the sharp barbs snagging on your gloves and canvas coat. Then came the splicing, twisting the new wire to the old with the pliers, a series of tight, precise rotations that required a firm, callous grip. A loosened post demanded digging, levering, and resetting, a task of pure earthy exertion. But the mind was free to wander, as your hands performed the simple, practiced motions, twisting, stapling, tensioning. Your eyes followed the fence line as it disappeared over a rise. This wire was the literal demarcation of your claim, the physical manifestation of a legal idea. On one side, order, cultivation, yours. On the other, the open, untamed land that did not recognize such concepts. The fence was a declaration, and its constant need for repair was the land's quiet, persistent rebuttal. You were not just fixing wire, you were repeatedly reasserting a human will against the natural forces. Chapter 44. The waiting, for rain, for the marshal, for supplies. Amidst the labor and the routine, the overarching condition of frontier life was a state of suspended anticipation. You were always waiting, not for grand events, but for the fundamental elements that would allow your current precarious situation to continue or to improve. This waiting was not passive idleness. It was an active, anxious form of endurance that colored every plan and tempered every hope. You waited for rain. After planting your seeds, your daily existence became an exercise in scanning the sky. You watched the cloud formations in the west, interpreting their shapes and movements with a hopeful, then often despairing, scrutiny. A bank of clouds that promised a soaking shower might dissipate before reaching your fields, or pass to the north, trailing a mocking veil of verga. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the air growing heavier, the insects falling silent, only for the promise to retreat. This waiting could stretch for weeks, during which you measured the declining moisture of the soil by the inch, your livelihood evaporating into the dry, static air. You waited for the law. If you had been wronged, cattle missing, a boundary disputed, you might ride to the marshal's office or the sheriff's in the county seat, only to find him out on another call, or away for days serving papers in a distant part of the territory. You would leave a message, a statement, and then you would return home to wait. Justice operated on a vast, slow timetable. The wheels turned, but you could not see them, could not hear them. Your grievance sat in a file, and you carried on, the injustice a constant, sour note in your daily thoughts, wondering if and when a badge would ever appear on your horizon to address it. You waited for supplies, your order of nails, cloth, medicine, or a replacement part for a broken implement was subject to the same vagaries as the mail. It depended on a merchant's order. Chapter 45. Sunday. A day of limited activity and reflection. In a life defined by unceasing labor and waiting, one day stood apart, its rhythm deliberately broken. Sunday. Even in the most remote or rowdy outposts, the concept of the Sabbath exerted a gravitational pull, not universally observed, but universally acknowledged as a different kind of time. It was a day of legislated stillness, where the normal engines of work and commerce were, by custom or ordinance, meant to fall silent. The most immediate change was the cessation of audible industry. The hammers, the saws, the anvils. These sounds were stilled. The saloons, if they operated, often did so with muted discretion. Their doors closed, their pianos quiet. The streets, freed from the press of freight wagons and the herds of livestock, took on a hollow, echoing quality. This silence was itself a profound phenomenon, almost startling in its contrast to the six-day cacophony, and it served to heighten the sense of separation. For the faithful, it meant gathering. A church service, if a preacher was in residence, was a social and spiritual anchor. In the absence of a proper church, a schoolhouse, a barn, or even a grove of trees might serve. The service was often long, the theology unadorned and direct, focusing on endurance, redemption, and the stark moral binaries that made sense in a hard land. The hymns, sung without accompaniment in ragged unison, were a poignant human sound against the vast quiet. For the less devout or the solitary, Sunday was a day of necessary maintenance of the self and personal effects. It was the day for the careful shave with a straight razor, the trimming of hair, the thorough mending of that one shirt that had been put aside all week. It was a day for writing letters, the slow, deliberate formation of words on paper, connecting back to the world beyond the horizon. It was a day for cleaning and oiling a firearm, not out of urgency, but out of ritual care. But above all, Chapter 46. The psychological weight of isolation. Beyond the physical hardships and the monotonous labor lay a more subtle, yet perhaps more corrosive challenge. The profound, soul-deep silence of isolation. This was not merely being alone for a day or a week, but a state of existing in a world where human contact was a rare event, where the landscape itself seemed to absorb sound and meaning, leaving the self as the only echo in a vast, empty chamber. On a remote homestead or in a solitary line shack, your own voice could become a stranger. You might go days, even weeks, speaking to no one but your livestock or yourself. Conversations, when they happened, were rehearsed in your mind beforehand, and afterward, the words would echo, picked over for meaning. The lack of external feedback, the nods, the interruptions, the shared glances of normal discourse, could make you doubt the very coherence of your own thoughts. The mind, deprived of social calibration, could turn in odd, recursive loops, fixating on minor grievances or imagined slights from the last interaction, however distant. The landscape contributed to this feeling. The sheer scale of the plains, the monolithic stillness of the mountains, did not offer consolation. They offered indifference. A sunset was not a shared spectacle, but a private, overwhelming display that underscored your own smallness. The wind, constant and impersonal, was a conversation partner that never listened, only spoke. In this silence, minor sounds took on monumental significance. The creak of a branch, the scamper of a rodent, the settling of your cabin's logs. Your hearing became acute, a defense mechanism, yet it fed a low-grade, persistent vigilance that was mentally exhausting. This isolation bred a peculiar form of self-reliance that could curdle into misanthropy. You grew accustomed to your own ways, your own rhythms, and the arrival of another person could feel like an intrusion, their habits irritating, their presence a d. Chapter 48. The gradual encroachment of barbed wire. A quiet revolution, delivered on spools of sharp, twisted steel, slowly redrew the map of the West. Barbed wire, patented in 1874, did not arrive with the drama of a gold strike or a cattle drive, but its long-term effect was more total. It was the end of an idea, the open range. Its gradual spread across the plains was a visible, and often violently contested, transformation of space, economics, and a way of life. For the homesteader or the nester, barbed wire was emancipation. For a relatively low cost and immense labor, he could fence his 160-acre claim. This tiny, defined rectangle became truly his. He could now plant crops without fear of them being trampled by wandering herds. He could breed improved stock without it mixing with the tough, stringy longhorns of the open range. The wire was a declaration of permanence and improvement, a belief in settled agriculture over nomadic grazing. For the cattle baron and the cowboy, it was a declaration of war. The open range was not just land. It was a system. It required vast, unfenced tracks for the long drives and seasonal grazing. Barbed wire strung across traditional trails and water sources was an existential threat. Cattle, driven by thirst, would press against the strange barrier, becoming entangled in the sharp barbs, dying of thirst or infection from their wounds. The wire fenced in cattle, but just as critically, it fenced out people. This led to the fence-cutting wars. Night riders, often cowboys paid by the big ranches, would sweep across the prairie with wire cutters, miles of expensive fencing collapsing behind them in the dark. Retaliatory violence flared. A fence was not just property. It was a symbol, and cutting it was an act of economic sabotage and ideological defiance. The wire's victory was slow but inevitable. It was a technology that served the future, a future of railroads, deed registries, and settled farms. As the spools unrolled. Chapter 47. The disappointment of played-out mining claims. The dream that drew thousands was not of labor, but of discovery. A glittering vein, a pan heavy with gold dust. For most, the reality was a slower, colder awakening. The played-out claim. This was the mineral frontier's most common epitaph. Not a dramatic disaster, but a gradual, grinding realization of diminishment. The promise of the land was exhausted, and with it, the hope that had fueled years of backbreaking effort. The signs were subtle at first. The color in your pan grew fainter, the flakes smaller and fewer. Where you once gathered a pennyweight in a day, you now scraped for half that. You told yourself it was a patch of poor ground, that the richer streak was just ahead. You dug deeper into the hillside, the work becoming more dangerous and costly as you needed to timber the shaft to prevent collapse. You followed a quartz seam that seemed promising, only to have it pinch out into worthless rock. The psychological toll was specific. Every day began with a residue of hope, which the day's labor systematically eroded. You would emerge from your diggings at dusk, your body aching, your hands cracked, and assess the meager yield on the scales. The arithmetic was cruel and inescapable. The value of the dust did not equal the cost of your food, your tools, your blasting powder. You were mining at a loss, spending physical capital to acquire a dwindling financial return. Around you, you saw the evidence. Abandoned diggings pockmarked the hillside like empty sockets. The once bustling camp grew quieter as others made the same calculation and moved on, chasing the rumor of the next strike. The merchants' prices remained high, but the flow of gold into the camp slowed to a trickle. A deep sense of futility set in. The mountain had been teased of its treasure, and you were left sifting through the leavings. To leave was to admit a profound personal failure, not just of luck, but of judgment and enduring. Chapter 49. The coming of the telegraph wires. Simultaneous with the horizontal lines of barbed wire came the vertical lines of the telegraph. Where fences partitioned the earth, telegraph wires partitioned the sky, stitching the continent together with a new, invisible network of instant communication. The arrival of the telegraph pole in a remote town or along a lonely railroad line was an event of quiet, profound significance. Promised an end to one kind of isolation, while imposing a new, more abstract form of connection. The construction was itself a spectacle of linear progress. Crews would move across the landscape, digging holes, setting tall, treated wooden poles into the ground at rigid intervals. Then came the wiremen, stringing the single, galvanized wire along the crossarms. The line would stretch to the horizon in both directions, a slender, humming thread against the immense backdrop. The poles themselves became landmarks, their regular spacing a man-made rhythm imposed upon the irregular land. The telegraph office, usually in the railroad station or a corner of the general store, became a place of hushed importance. The operator, often a young man with a delicate touch, was a new kind of high priest. His tools were the key, a tapping lever, and the sounder, a metal arm that clicked electromagnetically in response to distant signals. To the uninitiated, the clicks were a meaningless staccato. To the operator, they were the dot-dash language of Morse code, translating into prices, news, and personal messages. The immediacy was revolutionary, yet disorienting. News that once took months now arrived in minutes. The price of cattle in Chicago could be known in Abilene the same day, collapsing the advantage of local knowledge and tying local economies to distant, volatile markets. A person could be informed of a death or a birth almost as soon as it happened, collapsing the protective buffer of time and distance that had once allowed for a slow cycle. Chapter 50. A concluding thought on romantic versus actual history. We have traversed, in these quiet considerations, a distance measured not in miles, but in the minute textures of forgotten days. We have moved from vague geography to the grit in the coffee, from the boom of a mine to the silence that follows its exhaustion. This journey reveals not a world of heroes and villains, but a landscape of individuals engaged in a protracted, wearying negotiation with reality. The romantic history is a story of events. The shootout, the stampede, the strike. It is built on moments of peak drama. But actual history, the history that was lived, is the story of the intervals between those events. It is the story of the aching back after a day spent not in a chase, but in chopping firewood. It is the story of the mind dulled by the sameness of beans and the endless, empty sky. It is the weight of a sodden wool sock, the itch of unwashed long underwear, the slow, grinding disappointment of a played-out claim. This actual history is not less meaningful for being mundane. It is, in fact, more human. The drama of survival was not in the flash of a gun, but in the daily, unheralded decision to rise at dawn, to mend the fence again, to boil the water, to wait for the rain. The true wildness of the West was not in the lawlessness of its people, but in the profound indifference of its environment. An environment that demanded everything and promised nothing, that wore down dreams as efficiently as the wind wore down the sandstone cliffs. So why would you not last a day in the Wild West? It is not because you lack courage in a crisis. It is because the crisis is not the point. It is because you are unaccustomed to a life where every single comfort, every moment of ease, every bite of fresh food, and every second of true security has been arduously extracted from a resistant world through repetitive, solitary labor. You are unversed in the profound vocabulary of patience, in the Ari.